My name is Gurnam Singh.
My name is Manjeet Kaur.
Welcome to the One Show.
ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ। ਜਿੰਨੇ ਵੀ ਸਾਡੇ ਸਰੋਤੇ ਦੇਖ ਰਹੇ ਆ ਇਸ ਵੇਲੇ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਲੱਖ ਲੱਖ ਵਧਾਈ ਹੋਵੇ ਦੀਵਾਲੀ ਦੀ ਤੇ ਬੰਦੀ ਛੋੜ ਦੀ।
ਹਾਂਜੀ ਬਿਲਕੁਲ ਮਨਜੀਤ, ਸਾਰੇ ਹੀ viewers, all the viewers around the world, wherever you're watching, great Diwali badai and also Bandi Chhor. And for those of you who would know about the background of Bandi Chhor, literally Bandi Chhor means Freedom Day, and it was in 1619, some 405 years ago, when Guru Har Gobind, the sixth Guru of the Sikhs, was released from the Gwalior fort. And when Jahangir, the emperor at the time, offered to release him, Guru Har Gobind, he said that I will not be released unless you release the political prisoners. 52 political prisoners, the Bahari Rajas, were also released at the time. So it's a really important and special day for us today.
I know all our shows are special, but this one is extra special.
That's right, yeah. As I said, it's Bandi Chhor is Freedom Day. And so today we will be talking about human rights. We will be talking about human rights in the UK, the rights of children, and also human rights in India as well, of Sikhs and minorities. So that's going to be the first topic that we're going to be talking about today, is the whole question of the rights of children and the child grooming situation that's came out of Rotherham, but it's mushroomed now. It's engulfed the whole of South Yorkshire, and there are some suggestions that this is a national crisis. So we'll be talking about that in the first half of the programme, and in the second half we will be looking at the 30th anniversary of the Sikh genocide in 1984, which began, as you know, in June, but then all through until November, the assassination of Indira Gandhi and the massacre of up to 10,000 innocent Sikhs in Delhi and other parts of India. So it's a very special...
Yeah, don't forget, we've got very special guests today.
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah. I mean, that's the other very special thing about today. We've got some really special guests, so I think we should introduce the guests and then we'll get cracking with the show, yeah.
Yep.
So just to begin with, on my left-hand side, I'm really delighted to welcome Shabana Mahmood. Shabana is MP in the Labour Party for Birmingham Ladywood, and she entered Parliament in May 2010 in the general election, so some 4 years ago. Shabana is a Brummie, born and bred Small Heath. She's 34 years, and she was educated at she did law at Lincoln College, Oxford, before entering politics, and she was a practicing barrister as well. So next to Shabana we have Bhai Sarbjit Singh of Rajwana TV. Bhai Sarbjit he works in education. He's a graduate from University of Leicester in history. He's a human rights activist and a broadcaster, and you will have many times seen him on his own channel, Rajwana TV, talking about human rights in India. And so I'm delighted that you can join us as well.
Thank you.
If we turn to the right, I'll start on my immediate right. We have, again, very delighted to welcome Bhai Nishan Singh Sidhu Brar. Bhai Sahib was born in Malaysia, and he came to the UK in 1976. He's a permanent barrister in criminal law and a part-time judge specialising, as I said, in criminal law, having qualified at Gray's Inn School of Law in London in 1991. And next to Bhai Nishan Singh Ji, we have Paul Uppal, another real kind of figurehead for the Sikh community, who's been doing some really tremendous work. Paul is a Conservative MP for Wolverhampton South West, and like Shabana, he entered Parliament following the 2010 general election. Paul is 47 years old, was born in Birmingham, and he was educated at my old university, University of Warwick, where he did politics and sociology. So once again, delighted to welcome you all, and let's all begin with the Sikh greeting. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa,
Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Shabana, I would like to start off with you. So, how does a young Punjabi, Pakistani girl from Birmingham get into Parliament? So tell me about that.
Slightly by accident rather than by design. Actually, my lifelong dream from the moment I was this high was to be a barrister, and I actually, like a very famous criminal law barrister from telly, I wanted to be cabinet QC when I was a young girl. That was my life dream. But I was born into a Labour family, and my parents in particular were very passionate Labour activists, my dad especially, and many of my weekends were spent leafleting door knocking for the party and being out on the campaign trail. And it had always been a part of my life. It wasn't something I thought I was going to pursue and try and become a politician myself, but it was something I cared passionately about. And then in my late 20s, I happened to be back in Birmingham for a short career break from my job as a barrister. The Labour Party was selecting their candidate in Ladywood constituency to replace Claire Short, and I decided to run for it, and here I am.
So, I mean, following in the footsteps of Claire Short must have been a big challenge.
A huge challenge. Claire was a very well loved, respected, popular Member of Parliament. She had her disagreements with the Labour Party, but she was also a very passionate social justice advocate. So, yeah, big shoes to fill, definitely.
So, Paul, I'm just going to come up to you. So, what inspired you to enter politics?
I don't think my story is very different from Shabana's. In fact, at some point, I suspect Shabana's father and my father were members of Ladywood Labour Party exactly the same time, probably. I have to correct Budgie. Actually, Smethwick was where I was born.
For me, Smethwick's part of Birmingham.
Well, you better be careful putting that out as a black country. I'm sure we'll get some social Twitter feed on that. You try that at the Baggies ground anyway. But anyway, that's what I'd say is, for me, slightly different. I again, like Shabana, I didn't really have any aspirations to sort of go into politics. I think as a family, for us, it was slightly different. My background, they're born in Smethwick. My family, East African Sikhs. And we had an electrical business in Africa, lost everything, started again. And I think as a family, if you go through that experience, more than anything else, you learn one thing, and that's that politics matters. And I think as a community,
Punjabi, from Uganda or from
Kenya, from Kisumu.
But the Kenyan Punjabis, but the Kenyan Asians generally have been very successful in this country. What was the magic behind their success?
Well, I think it sort of follows on from the first question, in a sense. I think as a family, when you've gone through that experience, and you're quite right, if you look at, I think you look at all in the UK have all been successful, phenomenally successful. The fact that sometimes I think when you look at the East African Asian community, they were a very incredibly entrepreneurial bunch. And sometimes in this whole debate around people travelling across continents, John Major made this point recently, a few weeks back. He said somebody who travels thousands of miles across the world, leaves their family, leaves their extended family, leaves their network of friends, is a very driven individual. And certainly something, I think, within not just the East African Asian community, but amongst all people who've come from both from India and Pakistan and Bangladesh generally, are driven by that ambition.
So you'd be opposed then to the kind of policy that the Conservatives are developing on immigration now, because, you know, it's good to have immigrants in this country, yeah?
That, how you interpret it, of course, is a different way. And you've made a big jump from what I was saying from that. But I'm just saying there has to be a narrative of understanding that immigrants are self-selecting. These are people who are incredibly driven.
Okay, I've got a question for both MPs. In the 4 years you both have been MPs, what has been the most challenging moment for you guys? I'll start off with Siobhan.
I think that the riots of 2011, which affected my constituency, so just down the road from here actually in Winson Green, I think that Birmingham was on the cusp of the potential for further rioting along race lines, with different gangs in the city getting involved, different drug gangs, and obviously 3 young men lost their lives in my constituency. That was a very difficult, very challenging moment as a new Member of Parliament. I'd only been an MP for a year at that point, trying to play a constructive role, trying to bring people together, but also watching people in my constituency who I care deeply about suffering and grieving as well. That was a very challenging moment.
And also, I mean, it's a very old boys' club in Parliament, isn't it? Kind of Oxbridge. I mean, okay, you're Oxbridge, so that you can tick that box. But it's very much a white old boys' club, and you know, and as an Asian Mirpuri Pakistani woman, as we said. You are quite unique. How have you managed that? The culture, as it were, of Westminster. How have you negotiated that?
I think that by promising myself that I will never let myself get used to the culture in Westminster, and that I will always remember where I'm from. So for me, my home is Birmingham. I'm a Small Heath girl. That's where I was born and raised. Part of that is in my own constituency. I'm local to Ladywood. It's where I live. It's what I care most about. I never want to be part of the Westminster Village, as it were, because I think that makes you, that takes you away from where you're you're from, and I think my role there is to speak for the people that I represent. It is challenging though. I mean, you do stick out.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite
I'm sure
tough.
Paul's had this experience as well. I mean, my first week in Parliament, everybody kept confusing me with the Tory Cabinet Minister Saida Varsi, and you know, a few times I'd say, we don't all look the same, for God's sake. You know, it's the 21st century, you ought to be able to tell us apart. So, you know, you do have those moments as well, but I'm really clear in myself. I know where I'm
I
from.
mean,
I know
you
who I
mentioned
represent,
Saida
that's what I'm all
Varsi. She
about.
resigned on principle. Do you support her decision to resign on
She
principle?
resigned over the government's response to the crisis in Gaza, and
That's right, yeah.
I was equally critical of the government's response to that crisis, and I agreed with everything she said in her resignation letter and the statements that she's made since. I think the government mishandled that crisis and needs to play a much more even-handed role when it comes to the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, if we're ever going to see peace.
Paul, what about your challenges?
I think the number one challenge, which actually Siobhan alluded to there, is when you become an MP, is to remain grounded.
Yeah.
And I think a big part of that is the family background you come from.
Yeah.
And I know one thing that I certainly experience is when the minute I walk through the door at home, you know, I've been married for 23 years, I stopped being an MP, and the most important job I have is father to my 3 children and a
I
dutiful
thought you were going to
son.
say, I go for the prote.
Basically, you mean to say you leave your work behind, and
You have to leave
once you enter your
absolutely,
family
and the
house.
big part of that is the prote. And I tell you, and the big part of that,
Very
the
interesting.
big part of that, and Miri Karvali can testify to this, is making the prote in the morning and making the
I
jam.
was hoping that you might make the prote.
Yeah, I do.
Oh, okay.
I make the prote. You know, I mean,
How come you haven't put on white?
She clears
I
up.
have put on weight.
She clears up the mess.
No, but,
We'll
well,
have to have a Pronto bake-off, Paul, because I do Pronto as well. Very
Okay,
well.
all right, that's
I
a
think I make
that's a
good
challenge.
Pronto.
But in terms of challenges, Paul, I mean, you know, we are going to discuss the 84
of
papers.
course, and I was
know
coming
that-
on to that.
And that was a very challenging moment for you, because there were some sections in the Sikh community who were kind of going for you, let's be honest, yeah?
Oh yeah, absolutely, and you know that's you stand on a public platform,
Yeah.
and you that is absolutely necessary. But more important than that is, for so long as a Sikh, I think often for us as a community, there's been so much sort of heat. There's often been not enough light on the debate as well. And the important thing is how we progress this. We engage as a community with all voices speaking together. Not one group pulling this side, not one group pulling the other side. And because that ultimately has been the curse for us as a community.
I think I echo that. You know, I think. I mean, I heard some of the criticism, and I thought it was wholly unjustified. Some of the.
Okay. Well, we are going to come to that later on. We're just kind of still getting...
Right, I've got another question for you guys, the MPs.
Oh, I hope we're not monopolising.
Oh no.
Because this is
Don't
not
worry.
this is not the one show.
No,
it's
no,
a 2
no.
show.
No, don't worry about
Is it
that.
Georgian here?
It's
Soon
very
we'll get
difficult to
these
get you guys, pin you guys down.
Soon
so that's
we'll
all
get
right,
to
yeah.
these guys as well, don't
Okay.
worry. Sadly, we don't have many Asian MPs. Why do you think this is the cause? What do you think of that? What do you think is the cause
I think
behind it?
I mean, I think that there's a number of different barriers. So sometimes there simply aren't enough people within the pool that parties select from, because not enough people come forward. So there's actually a lot of passion about politics, different kinds of politics in our communities. But people don't often make that leap from being passionate about an issue to thinking that the way to really get involved is to get involved in party politics. I think what you tend to find in lots of minority communities is people will be part of different campaigns, political campaigns, but they don't often become members of political parties. And it's a constant challenge for myself, I'm sure for Paul as well, to convince people that actually, if you want to make a real difference to the policies that this government and the British government takes forward, then you've got to get involved in party politics. But it's a big challenge across the country.
But
actually
some
trying to
people would
speak
say,
for
then I
party
think maybe
politics.
Paul can come in, is that the dice is already loaded against young Asians from a certain demographic. You know, we talked about the Old Boys Network. I mean, is that true, or you know? I mean, you've broken through. Are you just kind of
Well, I mean,
freaks, or are you? You know, is it possible you can get in Parliament? Anybody can?
well, what I hope is, and I hope both me and Siobhan, whatever our political differences, just by coming on TV shows like this, we can actually show it is possible. The number one thing I enjoy more than anything else of my job is every Friday, if I can, I go into a school and I just tell them my story. You know, for 3 years, I was in a class where I was kept in a special class because the teachers thought I couldn't speak English. There was a guy called Mr. Breeden who spoke to me, and he says, "Paul, you can speak English." I said, "I can read it too, sir." You know, if he hadn't had that conversation with me, I wouldn't be a member of parliament. And I tell that story to kids in Wolverhampton and say, just because you're a
Yeah.
shy kid at the back, don't let anybody tell you there's a limit on how far you can go.
Sometimes actually that can be an advantage as well. If you get stopped by the police and you just say, officer, me no English, and then usually you frustrate the officer and they say, well, just get on your way.
Can I just say one story on that? I think I'm not sure I should say this on TV, but I think there was a story. You know, like in the early days, times were tough for us, and I think my dad and my da were out. And my dad always said to my mum, because she'd just come from India then, she goes, if the police officer comes, always say, you can't speak English.
Yeah, we don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so they
That's the
knocked on the
best way
door
out.
and they said, you know, she goes, sorry, I don't know. You know, I think they were after somebody. It wasn't anything to do with my family. I think the white officer says, "Koi gani Benji mainu Punjabi bhi aundy hai."
You got
And that
trapped
is
there,
a true
didn't you,
story.
Bill?
There you are.
And all the curry seats, she was just looking at him like that. And then I think she got my dai to speak to them or something like that.
That's a
But
great
luckily it's
story.
mistaken identity anyway. So.
Right.
Okay.
What message and what advice can you give to a youngster who's interested in going into politics? Either of you.
One piece of advice from each,
Yeah.
yeah.
I would say don't let anything hold you back. Get involved. Once you've decided which party you want to join, which one is most aligned to your personal beliefs and values, get involved. Don't let anybody stand in your way. People think you need loads of qualifications to be
Yeah.
elected, and you don't.
Right.
You need to be over 18. You need to be a citizen, and that's about it really. And so you should just go for it. Put yourself forward. Don't be shy. Don't hang out at the back. If you've got a viewpoint, make it heard.
That's brilliant.
You know, what I've seen in my whole life, not just politics, but anything, if you want to succeed, the number one thing you need is resilience. And that can either come from yourself. You know, sometimes if you go to a good school, that gives you the confidence, or if you've got a great family who can support you. Because what you'll find in life is, you'll have ups and you'll have downs.
Downs.
And it's coming out of the downs is the important thing.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not a smooth ride. You know, people may look at us and think it's a one-way street. It isn't. In politics, and I'm sure this is the same for Shabana as well,
Yeah.
there's a lot of times where you're going to get, you know, a very tough time. But believing in yourself and knowing you're doing the right thing, whatever your political views, will see you through that.
Okay, so we've heard from the two politicians. Let's talk to our non-politicians now. Nishan Singh, as a senior barrister, criminal law, part-time judge, you've reached the heady heights of your profession. And, in a sense, again, the same thing, the representation of people from our demographic is very underrepresented in law in the senior echelons. So what has been the recipe of your success? What is it? And you didn't start off as a lawyer, did you? You actually
No, I
started off
didn't,
in
no.
mental health nursing.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, when you did the introduction, I came to this country from Malaysia originally, and I did mental health nursing for about 10 years. Worked in a very well-known hospital, St Thomas's in London, and I was in senior management, and I decided I wanted to go into law. I think, like echo what everyone has said, at the end of the day, I think if you're determined and you want to pursue personally, I never had any obstacles in terms of, people outside were saying, look, especially then, why are you going to be a barrister? They're all Oxbridge and they're all white and they're all male, but I think partly because of where I was in Malaysia, we were minority element, the Sikhs are. And so it didn't
But
really
you're
phase.
son of an ex-army officer.
Yes, my
So-
father was.
So
Yeah.
there's plenty of cultural and
Yeah.
social capital behind you.
Yeah, and also I think it does make a difference when you've grown up where you are used to being in the minority and still getting on with life. And so it didn't really faze me when I came over here. But answer your question in relation to, whether it's difficult for Asians or Sikhs to get into the upper echelons of I think it was true back then. It was very, very difficult. You hear of some really, really horror stories of how Asians who went to the bar were being treated. They worked initially, in fact, blacks and Asians had what were referred to as ghetto chambers. They would really be on the periphery, hardly get any work. But I think that has all changed slowly. And in fact, when I started, even then, there were very few Asian barristers. But now, looking at the youngsters coming through, it's very, very encouraging. If anything, I think we've done a typical Punjabi thing where everybody is going to be.
Yeah, we started off with barber shops, and then we
Yeah.
became doctors and lawyers, and
And,
now we all want to become MPs.
And I think there are judges. I mean, from my chambers, there's a Muslim full-time judge now who's moved on from our chambers to be. He's at Wolverhampton, full-time Amjad Nawaz, Crown Court judge. There are many Asian judges. and I personally don't subscribe to positive discrimination, because I think by it occurring in the way it has now, those who are in the positions are actually very, very good at what they do.
Okay. Yeah. So, Sabji, in a sense, you're on the kind of beginnings of your career. Although even in the kind of at the beginning, you've made a massive impact. I mean, with Rajwana TV, there are very few young Sikhs that haven't heard of Sabji Singh Rajwana, and particularly seeing the way which you have great charisma and great commitment. And great commitment to fighting justice and human rights, But not a lot of other youngsters aren't kind of, in a sense, interested in that. They're interested in having a good time. They're interested in a job. Yes, we do pursue careers, but there's something there, So what is it that inspires you to kind of take the path that you've taken?
I think my journey started with a photo, really. When I was 16 years old, my dad used to keep a picture of Sant Janet Singh Khalsa Pindrawali in a house, even though he wasn't that religious. And I remember one of my family members came in and he said, "Why have you got his photo up there?" I said, "Oh, my dad said he's some kind of sant." He said, "No, he was a rapist, he was a terrorist, it was because of him that Harmandir Sahib was destroyed." And I always had that feeling in me that, well, maybe he's a bad man. Until I got to university and I started researching, and like you said earlier, I'd done a history degree. And I specialised in Operation Blue Star in my third year. And it was like the Matrix. Suddenly I thought, there's so much information here. When I was reading witness testimonies, watching speeches and shifting through information, I was thinking, this information nobody knows about, and that was probably 10 years ago. And so I started writing articles on some of the truth about what was going on, what I believed was the truth. They got published sort of in the media, and then it sort of crystallized 10 years later with the power of social media, with YouTube. Because I also thought that one of our failings was that we haven't, get justice, we haven't even been able to tell the story properly. And I thought that the social media, YouTube, would be a great opportunity, because our kids are changing, they're getting lazy, they're not going to go into libraries and read books. And one of the things that really hurt me, I asked for a book from a friend of mine who was going to India. I asked for a particular book, and he rang me and he said, "Look, I can't get this book, but I can get you KPS Skills book, I can get you Bra's book." He could get every book from some of the perpetrators of our genocide. So I thought even the history now is going to start being rewritten, so we sort of need to make some.
But I think what's been really quite unique about your work, and in a sense it links up with some of the kind of, that we've got barristers here, and is that you've been very forensic, as opposed to the kind of old-style politics in the Gurdwaras, which is very much around kind of there's one leader that kind of shouts a slogan and everybody kind of follows, doesn't really know what they're doing. But you've been very forensic. You've actually been putting the arguments to the test, haven't you? And that's quite a different kind of approach, hasn't it?
It is. I think the Indian government want us there. I mean, I think there was a time when there was an era of the slogans. I mean, people of our fathers' generations, they worked, they sort of battled racism, brought us up, educated us. When there was an issue, jump into a car and do a protest. But I think things have moved on, and I think the government are very happy when we're shouting Jakarta in the air and waving a Gurban in the air saying down, down Indian government. That isn't really educating anybody, and I think what's missing is that education. And even some of our Gurdwara and our institutions, I mean, really, you see, even not just Rajwana TV, there are Sikh organisations out there that are having to create sort of cyber Gurdwara, where we talk about issues that aren't being talked about in our Gurukars or within our organisations. So we have to give a voice somehow.
Okay, that's great. We're going to move now on to, these are the kind of pleasantries out of the way now. Let's get into some of the more serious stuff, yeah? I'm going to start with you, Paul. I mean, following the terrible revelations of the child sexual abuse, the grooming scandals in Rotherham, Professor Alex Jay actually published a report and said that at least 1,400 children had been groomed just in Rotherham. Rotherham's a pretty small town. This was like spread like wildfire. We were all shocked about that. But more recently, and in that report, and I think for the first time, the BBC began to name Pakistani Muslim men as the kind of demographic, if you want, as the kind of as the groomers. Up to that point, the category Asian was used. And I know that some Sikh groups have been campaigning for some time to actually challenge that kind of description. But more recently, we've found that in Sheffield, and possibly hundreds of children may be at risk, and that the police themselves have been let down. I think just these last couple of days, there have been some suspensions as well of police officers. And Anne Lucas, who ran the Sheffield's child sexual exploitation case until 2012, actually in a BBC interview, said that she regularly told senior officers in the South Yorkshire Police about these abuses, and they repeatedly failed to act. And that government targets seem to override. Government targets on things like burglary and car crime seem to be more important than this. So, isn't it really that we've all failed these people? I mean, this is a huge scandal, isn't it?
It is a huge scandal, and it's been perhaps one of the most disturbing things I think people have sort of seen on their TV screens when this sort of broke. And there was almost a suspicion, I think those of us who've been aware of and heard whispers about this for some while have been conscious of this, but to actually see it then formalised. And what I think was particularly disturbing was how widespread this was. And what perhaps is even more disturbing, there was almost a sense when victims were coming forward, these are the most vulnerable people who need to have their voices heard. There was a view, A, that, oh, this can't be feasible, or B, was it politically correct to turn the other cheek and pretend there wasn't a problem? And that, I think, is the most disturbing thing.
Yeah.
And some of the, without going into individual cases that we've heard, particularly young people who are looking for love or for affection, and being treated in the most devious and most dreadful ways is incredibly
But these were
disturbing.
children who were in the care system.
Yeah.
They were supposed to be under the protection of the authorities. And it seems like they were even more vulnerable in the care system. Isn't this an endemic failure in the care system itself?
I think it's what you've always had is, unfortunately, the reality of life, which we are now sort of waking up to. Obviously, we've had the sort of scandals involving Jimmy Savile and other high personality, is that we've always taken the view that people are attracted into good causes, whatever, for the most benign of motives. And yet the reality is there's a very dark, unpleasant side to the whole aspect of it attracting people. We've seen this in lots of groups within society. But
Who was in charge of this and who's responsible for this?
well, ultimately, I think there is everybody who's involved in this, almost a societal breakdown as well here of sort of going on. But I think the whole political narrative it's almost too dangerous a topic to talk about. Is the most toxic and poisonous
Well,
thing.
let me come to Shabana and put something which is very toxic, Shabana. I mean, as I said, you come from the Pakistani Muslim Mudbury community, and there's been a big finger pointed at that community, and rightly or wrongly. But let me just say something very specific. And in the Professor Jay report, it was suggested that there was collusion between Labour politicians, particularly in Rotherham, local politicians, councillors, and community leaders, as if there was almost a kind of silencing there. And I know that we've had problems with electoral fraud with some councillors and community leaders and vote banks and things. So do you think that this corruption that maybe back in the subcontinent we know about the way in which crime agencies work with community leaders and maybe even religious leaders, do you think some of that has crept into this country as well, and that we ourselves as a community have been protecting some of these abusers and groomers?
I think there was definitely a toxic sort of unwillingness to even acknowledge the beginnings of a problem, and I think that from what I've read of Professor Jay's report, there's a sort of a clear indication that there was a kind of desperation to not let the issue kind of go forward as it ought to have done. What individuals were responsible for that or what their motives were, I'm afraid I probably can't comment. And my own view would be that if people were deliberately stifling investigation and discussion of these issues, I personally think that's a matter for the police. And what I would want to see actually is some follow-up to some of those allegations, because whether it's officials in the council not wanting to pursue something because of some totally screwed up, misguided version of political correctness that frankly nobody should ever sign up to, or whether that's at the level of community leaders wanting to keep things quiet because they don't want scrutiny, both are completely and utterly unacceptable. And at the end of the day, these should have been criminal investigations into these people, into these perpetrators of this horrific abuse, and those people should have been in bars as quickly as possible. And whoever along the spectrum, whether it's an officer, an official, a self-appointed community leader, a councillor, whoever it is along that spectrum who stifled discussion, stifled investigation, I think all of them have very serious questions to
But
answer.
let me just pursue this one, and Paul touched on this as well about political correctness. For me, there's two types of political correctness. So there's one is the political correctness of white people who say we better not comment or criticise the Asian community because of cultural relativism, that somehow we haven't got a right to do that. But there's been a political correctness in our community where we said we don't wash our dirty linen in public. You know, we're already under attack, so we better just cover these things up. Is it time to start to wash our dirty linen in public?
Well, I don't consider criminal acts to be dirty linen. I consider them to be criminal acts, and as far as I'm concerned, that's not to be kept quiet. That doesn't help the victim, it doesn't help the wider community. All of those things should be public, because that is the whole point of having a public legal system, a rule of law that as British citizens we all sign up to. And I think it's a very dangerous idea if any community starts to think that this is for us to sort out ourselves. The law is there to protect everybody. The law should have been able to protect these victims, and anybody who stopped these issues from coming out publicly, I think, has let those victims down and are all equally guilty, actually, of the crimes that those victims ultimately suffered. The other kind of political correctness, which says we couldn't possibly allow this investigation to go forward because we might be seen to be racist, I think is a cop-out. I mean, people tried to use that here in Birmingham in relation to the Trojan horse allegations. And my own view is it's no council official should use, oh, I was afraid I was going to get called a racist, as some sort of excuse for their own incompetence. That's how I read that.
You
It's completely
mentioned
unacceptable.
the law. The law has let us down then. Seems like it.
Well, I think that I don't think it's the law itself. I mean, the legal powers to put these vicious, nasty abusers behind bars are all there. What's happened is we haven't allowed the investigations to happen as they should have done, and that's because people who did come forward, victims, children, were not believed. They were treated like trash, you know, because they're working class girls who maybe don't present themselves in a very articulate way, and they were ignored. It's easy to ignore them.
Let me pursue this one a bit more, but there is this concept within our community, and I know even in the Sikh community we talk about Gore Gandeya, and in the Muslim community this concept of haram, haramia, they're damaged goods. Do you think there is a pernicious ideology amongst our community that treats white working class people as something kind of inferior? Kind of reverse racism?
No, I don't see that. What I do see is an unwillingness to somehow, to sometimes acknowledge that the same problems that affect other poor communities affect religious minority communities as well. So this idea somehow that, you know, other people's children are going out there, going out, you know, getting up to all sorts of things when they're out, but it doesn't happen in our community. I mean, you know, I see the evidence of all communities being pretty much the same, and teenagers getting up to the same sort of stuff in my surgeries every single week. So there's sometimes, I think, an unwillingness to acknowledge that often the issues that afflict other communities affect your own community as well. I think that's where the
Sorry, in saying that, Shabana, I think there's a reason why there's this culture of twisted cultural sensitivity that we've got, where people are afraid. I mean, I was watching the subcommittee questioning the police, the chief constable of South Yorkshire Police, and there was absolutely horrific things of, you know, fathers going to rescue their daughters to find themselves arrested. Girls being arrested after being sexually abused just because they were drunk and disorderly, and the perpetrators just being left free. And I think that because there is this element that these seeds of Islamophobia that are planted, well, if you're going to accuse me of this, I'll accuse you of racism. And this culture where this is allowed to happen, 1,400 girls in Rotherham, Rochdale is rife, Sheffield is rife, Birmingham, Telford,
Oxford.
Derby, Oxford, Cambridge, it's all the way up to Carlisle. There has to be this culture of fear amongst lawmakers, amongst law enforcers and child protection, that if we sort of expose these people, even in my own area of work, there's a social worker who said to me that I have provided names with number plates, car models, pickup points, drop-off points, names, gangs, roads, only to be told by the law that it's not enough information.
So are you suggesting there is widespread corruption then?
I think
And collusion.
there has to be collusion, because this can't go unchecked for so long. I mean, this is 10 years.
Yeah.
And we've had people telling us that we had unidentified blogs coming into the council or into social services and removing files. We've had police officers telling us, don't concentrate on this, look at car crime and speeding. Now,
Okay, Nishan Singh, I'm going to come to you because you've got a unique kind of vantage point, because you've been trying some of these cases in court, and both as a barrister, but also I think in judgment. You know, one of the suggestions is that this is a uniquely Pakistani Muslim male crime. And you know, Sarabjit has just quoted a number of different areas, and you know, all of those that were reported did seem to, you know, kind of tick that box. Now, is that the case? Is it a Pakistani Muslim male crime?
I don't think the statistics would support that.
Certainly, the media reporting seems to suggest that.
I think it's always a danger whenever, I mean, clearly there has been a systemic failure in the way these matters have been investigated. But until there is a proper inquiry to see where the failings were, there is a real danger of hysteria in coming to conclusions without really drilling down to where the problems are. I mean, the South Yorkshire Police themselves, I think, they made a statement that at the moment, and it's a great indicator, the sex register in South Yorkshire, 90% of the offenders on the sex register are white males, 90%, and 2% are Asian.
Yeah, but you know,
But that's a very wide definition. You know, it could be watching.
I understand that, but
the narrow kind of crime of sexual grooming of taxi drivers,
Well, it's
particular night economy,
Yeah.
vulnerable white working class children in the care system, isn't the evidence overwhelming there?
The statistics are not there yet. Obviously,
Okay.
the breakdown.
I think it's unfair to say it's overwhelming. So I think race plays a part in this wider debate in two ways. So there's one which is this sense of we're not going to investigate it because of reasons of political correctness. We don't want to be called a racist. Completely unacceptable. A crime is a crime, and an allegation of a crime is an allegation of a crime. It has to be investigated properly in the normal way. But then the other side of that is to suggest that this is a problem of one specific community. They're the only people that do this, and they therefore have to, as a community, step up and sort it out. I think that's also, as we've just heard, not supported by the facts. And I think you mentioned Jimmy Savile, the historic cases of child sexual abuse across the establishment in our country is overwhelmingly white and male, and yet we wouldn't sit here and say this is a problem for white men and white men need to step forward and sort it out. So I think we do need to be a little bit careful that we don't feed this pernicious idea that this abuse happens only in one way, by one community, to one type of victim. And in fact, even Professor Jay said in her report that one of the real problems with this attitude at council level, at social services level, of seeing the problem only through one prism of Asian, Pakistani origin men and young white girls meant that they missed a whole load of abuse occurring of young Muslim girls by Muslim men in the community as well. So the idea that you can somehow just categorize it and say it only happens in this one way is completely wrong, I think, and it means that victims are ultimately let down, and we shouldn't let that.
No, I agree that we can't racialize the crime. But when we talk about Jimmy Savile and Gary Glitter and all these other heinous individuals, these are sort of predators who sort of prey on girls. Yeah. And when I talk about not racializing the crime, this is essentially men abusing children, but they were targeting girls. Now, what's particularly alarming about this particular type of grooming and paedophilia, and the word paedophilia for some reason is never used, it's always grooming. This type of paedophilia is alarming for us because it's networks of men. These were individuals abusing girls en masse. These are networks of men, particularly targeting ethnic groups. Sikhs have probably been talking about this since the 1980s, the target of Sikh girls in universities, in schools, and now it's moved on to, you look at the Birmingham report recently, that 80% of the victims were white girls. So this is targeted. So it's sort of a racial crime.
But if you look at the patterns of paedophiles, they do often work in gangs. Actually, even white paedophiles often operate
I'm not saying
in
that
gangs
they don't.
Of other paedophiles, and they tend to pick victims where they think they can get away with it. Actually, so they will pick vulnerable victims. They will pick girls hanging around outside a children's home, for example. They will pick places where they can get easy entry to and escape notice for as long as possible. That is the key pattern.
But that isn't that part of
it?
Okay, we shouldn't racialise, but if we're saying that this is predatory crime, that's what you're suggesting, yeah? And certainly, Paul, I mean, you know, it's been suggested that it's part of a kind of taxi driving, night culture, certain areas, and there are some patterns there, you know, that these predators, and I've read some research papers on this, that whilst, you know, we shouldn't blame Muslim men, certain demographic of Muslim men who work in this night economy seem to have had more access to these vulnerable young women.
You know, I think I'm going to broaden this out. Broaden it out slightly a little bit. And this is my own experience of just. If you look at young black men in particular, they have an you know, I did a lot of work in sort of late 1990s about why young men, black men, have a predisposition to go towards gangs. And in essence, when you actually scratch the surface and you look at the research, what they're looking for is a sense of belonging. Almost a substitute family in a way. They're looking for positive male role models. Now, for a lot of these young women, what they were looking for is almost a substitute affectionate system that's there, you know, and these individuals were able to spot that and manipulate the situation. The second point I'd like to make is I have a Muslim councillor in my constituency, and one of the discussion we have more than anything else is about the role of our young men. He constantly goes to me and says, you know, Paul, we've got real issue with our young boys in terms of where they're going. And I stopped and thought, I said, well, actually, we as Sikhs have got this issue as well. A real issue in terms of our young men finding positive moral. And if I'm going to say something uncomfortable as now, the one thing that sticks in my throat more than anything else is the minute, and we all know this, and everybody who's watching this will know that, the minute a daughter is born into our families, people are on the phone, invariably women who say, "Koi gal nahi." No worry about
you hear
this.
that quite often.
So, I mean, subconsciously, what damage does that do? What does it say to our
Starts
young?
from day
What
one,
does it
doesn't
say
it?
to young women about other women? About women having a second-class role? About young men? How do they view women as well? You know, and we, coming from the teaching from our gurus, which is so much about egalitarian opportunity. Anybody who knows a Gurdwara, I'll tell you where a Gurdwara runs from. It doesn't run from the men in the committee room. It runs from the bibia in the kitchen. And anybody who knows anything about our faith and yet culturally, that hangover we have. So it starts almost from day one.
So who are we blaming? Is it?
I mean,
is
who
it
is
the
to
one-
blame?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I mean,
Well, I think one of the things, at least, I hope we can on this actually have an honest discussion about this. You know, sort of address it
definitely.
for us.
so we're all to blame. We all
Well,
have
as a community,
responsibility.
well, you know, there are people out there who, and you know, there's political correctness, and we spoke about, but sometimes for us as communities, also to be really candid about this and talk about our own failings with it. Because if we refuse to talk about that, we're not going to tackle this head on as an issue.
I think absolutely. I mean, we a few weeks ago we had a program on sexual violence against women, and one of the main points that came out in that discussion was that within our community, we need to develop a language to talk about sex, about abuse, about rights, and about women's needs and children's needs. And it seems to me that that's a kind of taboo that we need to break. And I think we would all agree with that. And we need to empower young people as well. Time is running away from us, and I know that we've got our final and very important topic. And I do want to also at some time give the listeners, the viewers, an opportunity to ring in as well. But I just want to move now on to the we are commemorating the 30th anniversary this year of the Operation Blue Star, the attack on the Bar Sahib, which precipitated, I think, a whole chain reaction. Which very spectacularly on the 31st of October 1984, 30 years ago, we saw the assassination of the then Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi. And following that, for some 3-4 days, we had what is generally recognized as a pogrom against Sikhs. And figures go from 10,000 were massacred through to 20,000. I'm going to go to Sarjit Singh Rajwan on TV. You've done a lot of research on the whole kind of 1984 June, November, and you know, I mean, Rajiv Gandhi at the time talked about when a big tree falls, the land shakes. You know, there's a kind of, I mean, and people interpret that as an implicit sanctioning of the violence. And if that's the case, if it's unambiguous, then you know we've been fighting case after case after case, yet the truth was always there. But 30 years on, nothing's happened. Do we need to move forward now, move on and try something else?
I think we do need to move forward, and even like with somebody like myself, I've got a normal job, I've got a family, I want to move on with my life as well. But there's something in me that makes me feel like a victim every single day of my life because of this. And I think that we can sort of move on, but until the perpetrators of this have been sort of brought to justice, like Sikhs haven't had their Nuremberg trials just like the Jews had theirs. In fact, those people who organised this, people who were MPs at the time became cabinet ministers afterwards, and they were promoted. Narasimha Rao, I don't know what post he held at that time. A few years later, he became the Prime Minister of India after being implicated in the Delhi massacres. So I think we haven't even been able to define it as a massacre. I think these are the failings.
But you know, the Nazis lost, and that's why we had the Nuremberg trials. If they'd have won, we wouldn't have them. A more closer comparison might be South Africa and the Peace and Reconciliation Commission, where we know of extrajudicial killings. And to a lesser degree, maybe also Northern Ireland as well. I mean, isn't that where we should be going, really? Rather than expecting that somehow we're going to get any justice. You know, those politicians in India, they're so powerful. They're not going to. I mean, they're evading the courts in India.
But I think Sikhs aren't an interesting project to get involved in from the international community. We probably don't have masses of oil. We don't have lots of natural resources. And I think the economic power of India is sort of to the degradation of the justice for Sikhs, because I can't see an international community willing to go into India and say, right, show us the evidence, and the evidence is there, it's just nothing's been done about it. And that's why I think it's a bit difficult for us to talk about an international community doing something for the Sikhs, because I don't think anybody wants to get involved in it.
Okay, Nishan Singh, we've talked about South Africa, we've talked about the Anglo-Irish agreement, and
Yes.
how under that agreement there was a special provision for IRA and loyalist convicted killers to be released on licence for some truth, some closure to it. Is that the way forward now for us?
I
Is that
think
feasible?
I think they're very different when you really analyse it, because one, there has to be a willingness for, if you like, the host country, in this case England, Britain, in that case India.
A gesture to release by Rajowana. I mean, if they released him, wouldn't that have warm the hearts?
Yeah,
of the
but it's more fundamental than just releasing Rajowana. I think if Rajowana himself wouldn't be happy to be released if he thought, in fact, all the things that he stood for
Yeah.
were not looked into. But I think here in Ireland, there was an armed struggle for a very long time. There was a massive armed struggle, and ultimately, because of the proximity, the fact that I suppose in some respects you could argue that it's very different to Sikhs, because there was a separate country in that Southern Ireland was in existence. There was plenty of support from the Americans, so they were in a very, very unique position. And in the end, there was a political will by Britain to really find a resolution, because so much time has passed, and both sides were losing soldiers and men. Whereas in India, I mean, you talked about other countries trying. It's just not realistic. No other country is going to go in there.
Well, Burma,
and how do they compel?
Burma, we seem to, got out of the kind of junta, and there seems to be some kind of reconciliation. I mean, is there any way out for the Sikhs? Should we just now just?
I think
read to
again,
history?
Burma. It's about the Burmese people. We are such a small minority in India. I mean, the sort of work, and I've got a great deal of respect for the work that he does. But I think what we can't do, I know we should move on, but we can't forget.
Yeah.
Because the atrocities of young children having tires put around their necks, set fire, ask those mothers who are there, should we forget? No.
So what you're saying is that, in a sense, symbolic, we should be building museums, we should be getting, obviously, support for the victims. But in terms of getting justice, you think that's a dead?
I think it's difficult, but I think we can certainly, as groups, push for India to rectify some of the human rights treaties.
They have had an opportunity.
Okay,
to
we've got a call in, and the two MPs haven't had a bite at this cherry yet, so maybe these calls could be where you're buying. So let's just take the call. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ
ਜੀ ਭਾਈ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਹੈ ਸਿੱਖ ਅਕਾਲ ਚੈਨਲ ਤੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਦੱਸੋ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕੀ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਜਾਂ ਇੰਗਲਿਸ਼ ਵਿੱਚ ਦੱਸੋ ਜਾਂ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਚ whatever you want.
ਹਾਂਜੀ I'll keep it in English because the show has been conducted in English, so we might
keep it short as well so we can get some more callers in. Yeah.
ਹਾਂਜੀ my name's Kuldeep Singh. I'm from International Pantik Dao, and I think we can draw a direct comparison with 1984 with the grooming, in that you said that there were individuals who were implicit in keeping justice from being, keeping justice away from the victims. And I think as Sikhs, really, we, a lot of us have actually kept this subject in the background, and especially with something Sarabjit Singh said, which is very poignant, in that there's cyber Gurdwara that are being made now, because the real Gurdwara won't discuss this issue, they won't bring it forward, they won't mark the days, and I think that's where the problem really lies. And I know the people at the Bibia and the kitchen do run the Gurdwara in fact, but I think the committee members can do a lot to change how much this is discussed and within the Gurdwara, because for many years we were made to feel ashamed. We were for even discussing it, and there was things about being a terrorist even if you discussed it. But the facts are so clear now, and I think for young Sikhs now, I think the one phrase we can't have now is somebody coming forward and saying, but I want to know what went on, because the evidence is just completely overwhelming. It's so one-sided. For any Sikh to say they don't understand what happened and they still need to know.
Kuldeep Singh, I think you've made some really good points. So thanks I'm going to put a question to Paul. So thanks very much for your contribution.
Thank you.
Paul, certainly what Kuldeep Singh's suggesting is that, 25, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, there was a sense that, these are radicals, these are fundamentalists, these are extremists, and that was a propaganda subject. But today, it's become a mainstream issue. Most sections of the Sikh community now are unanimously, saying, if you look at what happened with the papers that were released in Parliament, they were all there, all the Sikh councils, and lots of pressure was put on you as well. So in some senses, the Sikh community now is stronger in making its arguments, even if the arguments are not being heard.
I think they are, and I know from my own discussions with various politicians, there is no interest, certainly from a British perspective, to hide any documentation on this. There's no interest in that. Eventually that will come out anyway, and that will be counterproductive. I think the whole issue that we've sort of spoken about today, and what I've always said, I'm not going to name all the politicians I speak to, but I have a running dialogue, obviously, on this issue with politicians based here and also in India as well, through the interactions I have there. That I think one of the issues has been that India has probably had the perception that over a natural effluxation of time, this issue will subside. And because the people who are involved in it and the victims of this whole injustice will just either they will pass away, or there'll be a natural process of time when this will go. And the point I always say to them, particularly I'm talking from an Indian perspective here, is to say, I actually think that is a short-sighted approach, because actually, until you actually bring people to justice on this, until you actually move to get some element of closure, you will not solve this. This will be a running sore, and the wound will just get deeper and deeper and deeper.
I just wanted to go to
Manjit, can I just take a call and then we'll, so we have another call and we'll try and share. ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ ਹਾਂਜੀ ਭਾਈ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਜੀ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਅਕਾਲ ਚੈਨਲ ਤੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਆਪਣਾ ਨਾਮ ਦੱਸੋ ਤਾਂ ਕਿੱਥੋਂ ਕਾਲ ਕਰਦੇ ਹੋ
ਮੇਰਾ ਨਾਮ ਖਵਿੰਦਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਹੈ ਜੀ and I'm speaking from Huddersfield.
ਹਾਂਜੀ Kavinder Singh, what would you like, just keep your contribution short and we can get more callers in, but please tell us what you'd like to say.
Yeah, what I'd like to say is, we've just spoken about the amount of examples we've got of human rights abuses that happened in 1984 in Delhi. If somebody wants to see something, on the 8th of November at 7:30 at the Drum in Birmingham, there's going to be a theatre production, and in that theatre production the people from America are doing a world tour. And if somebody wants to see exactly how the families, a witness account of some children, what happened to their families, it needs to be seen on that show at 7:30. And I'd like everybody sitting there today on your channel, including yourself, to come attend that show and see a Jewish production on what happened to the Sikhs in 1984 in Delhi, and the massacres that took place, and eyewitness accounts are going to be depicted in a 2-hour play there.
Okay.
So please, it's called The Kultar's Mime at the Drum on the 8th of November, 7:30. Come down and see for yourself what happened to the children. And this is communities, outside communities, performing a theatre play in English for the world to see.
Okay,
you will see exactly what's happened.
Thank you very much for that.
Please, we've got overwhelming evidence of what's gone on.
Yeah, no, that's great, and we will try and cover it as well. Thank you.
Sabri, I just want to go back what you were saying earlier. You mentioned you feel like a victim. Now, why should you feel like a victim? Victims are the families have been destroyed out there. They're the victims.
Yeah, I'm often accused of that. Like people in Punjab or India, they're quiet, and you guys are making noise here. But I think it's the silence of the graveyard in India. I think they've been beaten into submission, and I think if we've got any humanity, like we need to be their voice. Imagine I live in a country where the head of the Cumbria police was misusing his credit card. He was investigated, taken out of office, and then they looked at the laws around misuse of credit cards. How can we tighten them? Punjab lives in a place where the chief of police, the DGP, Sameed Seni, has got countless cases of human rights abuses. He's implicated in the murder of Professor Pullar's family, and he is running law and order in Punjab. How do you expect people to feel when the killers have been elevated to such positions?
Let me come to you, Shabana, on that. It's famously known that a third of all Indian politicians have got criminal cases pending against them. The last election, I think a third of the MPs that actually won have got criminal cases against them. The Prime Minister himself has been implicated in the Gujarat massacre of Muslims there, unanimously. You talked about how with the case of Gaza and how politicians resign. As a principled politician, what's your view about the British government doing business with a government that's not only got the 1984 massacre, it's got the Gujarat massacre? I mean, is there any principles left in politics, or do you think it is all about business and all about deals?
I mean, I think it's a lot more complicated than that. So firstly, I don't think, and I often say this to people from the Indian community, Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities, but all three nations with governments with clear issues around corruption and allegations of corruption in countries where often the biggest complaint that British diaspora communities have is that you go over there's no sense of rule of law, there's no system, and so on. They're not the only countries that are afflicted with that problem. So sometimes I think we're a bit, we somehow have this debate where we imply that they're the only ones with a problem. Actually, what we've learned, for example, about the police in our country and systemic corruption over a number of decades in relation to Hillsborough, notebooks going missing. We've just seen that another police force has made a compensation payment to a woman who got pregnant by and had a child with an undercover police officer. She didn't know he was there to spy on her. So this idea of broken systems, it's not unique to the subcontinent. It is a problem that affects governments all over the world and has affected, and in some ways we learn has continued to affect even our own establishment, even our own authorities and government as well. So that's just the first point to make.
But let's be specific. I think you're very, Mr. Modi, I think the Prime Minister has been on record as saying that he has an open invitation to Mr. Modi to, not long ago, Mr. Modi was banned from this country and from the United States. What's changed?
Well,
business.
The British government has a relationship with the Indian government, and the British Prime Minister is making his judgment call about who he will and won't speak to, and I don't think it's for me as an opposition politician to get between that. But where there are serious questions for even prime ministers and presidents to answer, we shouldn't be afraid to put questions to them. That's a great thing about our the freedoms we enjoy in our country. We should not be afraid. So when
are you going to go on record and say that if representations are made to you by Sikhs or Muslims or others who can give you documented evidence of the culpability of if not Modi, if any entourage of people that he brings, would you go on record and say that you will ask questions?
I would ask any questions that are backed up by evidence that my constituents.
Okay, let's take another call. Can I take the next call and then we will come. ਹਾਂਜੀ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ
ਹਾਂਜੀ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਿੱਥੋਂ ਬੋਲਦੇ ਆ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਨਾਂ ਕੀ ਹੈ
ਹੈਲੋ
ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ
I think it's Dabinderjeet Singh here.
ਹਾਂਜੀ ਭਾਈ
Okay, Dabinderjeet, I'm going to give you a minute.
No problem. My question is very simple. It's targeted to the two politicians. 30 years ago, the cabinet of this country decided to ban a procession in London while the bodies of innocent Sikhs were smouldering in Delhi and throughout northern India. Was it right for the British government and the police to ban a Nagar Kirtan in London 30 years ago?
Okay, that's a pretty clear question. Paul, was it right?
Well, this case, which I've heard Dabinderjeet raise also in meetings with ministers as well. I've been there where this has been raised. And there's always been an issue about what was the security involved or I cannot go into the details of who the ministers were because Dabinderjeet will know he was in that room at the time, and they've given a full answer to this question as well. It wasn't actually, from what I understand, it wasn't just a banning in relation to what was going on. There were some security issues around there. But obviously I can appreciate at the time the sensitivity with everything that was going on. It was perhaps, on hindsight, perhaps quite a prosaic approach to what should have been a much more...
This is a typical politician's response. You want to each way bet. I mean, you're going to be standing for re-election and there are noises out there, and the Sikh Federation have been, using words like betrayal. I mean, what would you say to them?
Dabinderjeet's been in the room when he was given a full answer to that question. I'm not going to. He knows exactly who answered that question to him directly. I was there. There were lots of other people in that room, and so there is. I can't break those confidences. You understand that, Uncle? That's that's.
Paul, can I just ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, Dabinderjeet's obviously not in the room, so. You mentioned that you've had dialogue with Indian politicians, and obviously without going into particulars and names, what type of dialogue is that? Because, this is the 30th anniversary of the November massacres, which I call massacres. I don't know whether you will call them a massacre or a riot. But this is the 30th anniversary, and after the 30th anniversary of Operation Blue Star, obviously we had the British collusion and all that sort of. And you as the Sikh MP and the ambassador to the Prime Minister, you said that you wanted a full investigation that would sort of satisfy the community and put our sort of fears at ease that the British were complicit in it. The report that was delivered by the Cabinet Secretary was shambles. It raised more questions than answers, and in fact it was quite an insult. Since then, it's been 9 months probably, I think it's been 9 months.
Less than 9.
Less than 9 months. Let's be less than. What has happened with that? Because it doesn't fill me with confidence when you say you've been talking to Indian politicians, when the whole issue seems to have died a death, and nobody, I think, in the Sikh community is happy with that report. With yourself as the only Sikh MP, what is happening there?
Have you read the full report?
I have. In
But-
fact, I've done a response to the report in a video.
Okay, I mean, in the report, without going, spending the rest of the time actually going it through verbatim, it actually quotes the officer who went there and the specific things he uses. The advice he says, not for the Indians to do this. He uses the term sledgehammer to crack a nut. If you've seen, the other thing is because some people read the report and they haven't read the appendages as well, where the officer actually specifically goes through these particular points.
But there are certain things, Paul, that are just galling to us, like the Golden Temple was out of control. Nobody went over to the Golden Temple to see what does out of control
I
look
just
like.
want to
Can I?
I think
important point, because this is the most
Just final
important
point, then I want to Shaban,
the,
yeah.
the one question, about the Indian, and this is not my words. These are Lord Singh's words as well. For the first time in 30 years, he went to the Indian High Commission and he said, "Look, there has to be some element of closure on this." And what he was met with, the response was, "We agree with you." Now, whether you think they're lying,
But it doesn't take a genius to say we need
Okay,
to.
let me
but-
just, Paul, if I can just come to Shaban, because I think this Ed Miliband has not only been on record, he's actually put it in writing, that if Labour do have the opportunity to have some power in the next, that they will actually support some kind of independent inquiry. Can you, affirm your support for Ed Miliband's position on this?
Yes, and in my own right, I supported an independent inquiry as well. And the reason for that actually is, I think, has just been shown by the discussion that we've been having. Sometimes when you have quite a limited inquiry, something that's quite limited in scope, it does raise more questions than answers, and people walk away from the process feeling more demoralised, more disheartened than they were at the beginning of it. And then there's more mistrust as well. And I'm very sorry, I have to apologise. I wasn't aware of the call that the other caller alluded to, the case, about the banning. So I'm not aware of the facts of that, but I was interested that there'd been a discussion behind closed doors, and I'm sure everybody who took part in that did so in good faith and tried to come to a resolution, and that's to be commended. But sometimes when things are also happening behind closed doors, but they're of concern to thousands of people all over the world, because the community lives all over the world, I think that can also cause more misinformation. Things get lost in translation. What one group of people know is not known by another group, and the only way really, I think, to end that sense of continued misunderstanding is to have something that you publish all the papers and you have an inquiry and you let people go away.
Nishan Singh, coming from, there are kind of quasi-legal kind of questions here around independent inquiry, whether it's judicial inquiry, whether it's a parliamentary inquiry. I mean, is there some mileage? Is it useful?
I think we have to be clear about what it is we are trying to look for. I mean, I understand, the concern saying that there are more questions than answers. I think there were over 23,000 documents that were looked at in this inquiry. The real nux of what happened in 1984 was done by the Indian government. At that time, it wasn't uncommon for different nations to seek advice from, Britain, maybe not as quickly from America because they have a very poor record of siege. But by the time the Golden Temple was stormed, none of the British advice was taken on board. It became a military ground operation with tanks, soldiers. When the British officer had given the advice, and I'm pretty sure if the Sikh
But it's General K.S. Brar that's saying that the advice wasn't taken.
Well, and the British,
it is documented,
and the British government says
the officer specifically says, if this goes wrong, the Indians will blame us. So he specifically
so it's not just
said,
Brar, it's actually the officers.
the officer says, do not do this.
And I think the first advice by the British government to them was that our advice is not to do it. But if you are going to do it, it should be precision. So, and the reason being as little collateral damage as possible.
So the British government not only relented, actually they were on our side. I mean, in a sense, they were.
Well, I think I think they shouldn't worry about if in fact ultimately the Sikh community, the only way they'll get satisfaction is by holding an independent. I'm confident that it would actually not show or lay any blame at the door of the British government.
So what's the point then of just dragging something out when
I think
you
it's
know,
not
to the
dragging
fait
something
accompli?
out. I think if the Italian government had approached the British government and said, right, we need some of your stormtroopers, give us advice and guidance on how we can land in the Vatican and kidnap the Pope. Will you please give us some advice on how to do that?
That's not a good analogy.
I think it is, because Sant Bhindranwale was our religious leader at the time.
I understand that. But
Harmandir Sahib is the holiest shrine for the Sikhs.
if something happened in Italy and the Pope was, the whole population is Italian, we are a small minority
He's still,
there.
he's still an innocent man. He's still a democratically elected religious leader.
Can I cut the reality of this?
Just last 5 minutes as well.
Okay,
yeah?
one thing, and Shabana may not be aware of this, and you've got a lot of respect for Shabana, but I just want to clarify one thing. I don't think the leader of the opposition has put in writing that he wants an independent inquiry. I'm quite clear on that, okay? The second point
I've
is...
seen a letter from him saying that he supports that.
Would you publish that then?
Well, I think it's been probably Sikh Federation have published it.
No, but well, you know that, and then I would like to see that. Okay, if there's a written commitment, that's fine, and that's fine. I'd like to see. The second point is the reality is the real solution for this. The cause of this lies in India, and the solution lies in India. You cannot deny that. And everybody in international opinion, all the politicians, whatever political side of the fence, they actually know that. They know that's the reality of it. And the one thing I do sort of take particular umbrage with, I do not like to see our community used as a political football in this. That is the last thing. For us as Sikhs, we want to see the people who perpetrated this come forward and have, sort of justice should reign its hand on this. That's the reality. How we achieve that is the most important thing.
So you want them to come forward? I mean, they had a perfect opportunity to apply some balm to our wounds when Sajjan Kumar was in the Supreme Court. Countless affidavits said we saw him pointing out a Sikh home, pointing out the Garbganj Gurdwara, put a tyre around this guy, a burning tyre, giving voters lists, giving school registers that this is where Sikh kids live. And when
So
the Supreme Court...
isn't it naive to think, I mean, we talked about Modi, and if you look at it, and there's, I think uncontroversial evidence that he was complicit if he wasn't directly, and he's been, he's a big fish. I mean, the others are just small fish, aren't they? We're just backing up now a pointless kind of a...
It could be seen, and I mean, Modi is somebody who told Sikhs to get out of Gujarat, told the Sikh farms to get out of Gujarat and go back to Punjab because you don't belong here. So,
okay, right, we have got 2 minutes. So, Shabana, I mean, is it possible to be a politician and also have principles?
Yes, I think.
Yeah.
Look, we come into politics. So I came in, I'm sure Paul, the same reason, because we believe passionately in a set of values, differing values perhaps, because of our different political allegiances, but a set of values about how a country should be run and how we should behave towards each other as citizens. And if those things don't sustain you in politics, then it's a pretty poor life to have. So I would challenge the cynicism behind that statement. None of us come in. This is a privilege and an honour to do this job, and it's an honour and a privilege because it's about serving our communities and fighting for a better society in our country.
Paul, last comment, and UKIP has got the mainstream politicians on the run because they're saying you don't stand up for what you believe.
You know, what UKIP do is they're very easy to appeal, and in a way perhaps the show, and also with various groups who talk about it, it's very easy in a pub. Everybody in a pub can pick the England football team, right? Everybody can. They say we shouldn't have this guy on the left back or the right back, and it's same with politics. People want sometimes in politics a yes or no answer. That's the most common thing you hear. Sometimes, very rarely, you can give that. But the reality of life, it's very different about that. Almost all politicians, not all of them, including, some on my side and some on Shabana's side, almost all of them, I believe, are principled individuals. Some people may have, you need an ego maybe to go into politics. But certainly I know, and my children know this as well with me, and I'm a trustee of a Gurdwara as well. You go in it and you do it in a pragmatic way that you can.
We have run out of time. Manjit, you want last word?
To be a true Sikh, you have to be... you have to fight for human rights and all human rights.
Absolutely, and we've been talking about human rights today. Bandi Chhod Divas is all about human rights, about freedom. It's the rights of all people, and I think that we've had a good discussion today. So thank you very much to all the participants, and thank you to the callers as well. We won't have a programme next week because there's going to be an account part, but we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. So from today's programme, Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.